I've been unemployed for 6 years now, I think it is, and I'll probably never be employed again. And there's a reason that I can't get a job. It's a miracle I ever had a job to begin with, but that was kind of a unique situation how I landed that job. And, the stars aren't all going to align like that again. And at this point, I can't even manage to get an interview. But even if I could, it wouldn't matter anyways, because the reason that I am unemployable, and I'm not alone in this, there's a lot of men out there in my same situation, but the reason I am unemployable is because I will never be able to make it past the interview stage. And the reason for that is because of my personality. And really, it's a combination of my looks and my personality. But specifically, what I'm talking about, it's my social anxiety. I'm going to share a personal anecdote with you about my experience with job interviews so you can see just how bad my social anxiety is, because it's really frustrating anytime I try to talk about my social anxiety on here because everybody thinks they're the expert. Even normies that definitely don't have social anxiety. I mean, everybody has social anxiety to some extent. Even extroverts have social anxiety sometimes in certain situations. And I think that's why everybody's always so quick to dismiss my experience, because everyone has felt shy or felt nervous in some kind of social situation at some point in their life. So people hear me talk about having social anxiety and they just think, oh, you just got to get over it, bro. You just got to power through. Because they're thinking about their own experiences and projecting that onto me. And they can't even fathom, you know, listen, there's levels to this shit. Just because you feel anxious sometimes in social situations, that doesn't mean you know what it's like for me. Because if you did know what it's like for me, then you would never even think about saying some shit about exposure therapy or just power through or whatever. When it comes to getting a job and getting hired, even for STEM jobs, it's like no matter how complex or esoteric the job is, your personality is more important than your qualifications. The most important criteria for any job, no matter what it is that the person interviewing you wants to hang out with you. If you don't pass that test, then it's over, period. And that's a test that I could never pass that test. Nobody wants to hang out with me because I don't have a likable personality. Even if I didn't have severe social anxiety, I'm just not a very likable person in general. But whatever, because that doesn't even matter because I do have social anxiety and I have it really, really bad. So bad that I can barely manage to even show my personality in the first place. So even if I did have a personality that just meshes perfectly with the person interviewing me, there's no way we would even figure that out because I can't show my personality. I can't show my true self. I can't be my true self. I'm just playing pretend everywhere I go is what it feels like. So the job interview I want to talk about, it was just a phone interview, but it was brutal. And this happened a long time ago, back when I was still employed as an engineer. So I actually already had a job when I completely embarrassed myself in this interview. So, so much for the whole abundance mindset thing. But anyways, so this was back during my gym maxing phase. So I was going to the gym like 6 days a week to lift weights. And during the winters, I just went every day because I would go on my rest days to use the exercise bike or run on the track since it was too cold outside to do cardio. So if you've ever been a regular gym goer, then you know you pretty much see the same people every day at the gym. So there was this one guy, and I had been seeing him there every day at the gym for probably like a year or something at least. And I never really talked to anybody there because, social anxiety. But one day, this guy, he comes up to me, and I think he was just asking me like how many sets I had left on the squat rack or something like that. So I told him I was almost done, and then he noticed I was wearing a t-shirt from the school that I got my bachelor's degree from, and I guess he went there too. So he asked me what I majored in, and I told him, and it turned out he had the same degree, and he had graduated like 2 or 3 years before me, I think. So, anyways, then he starts talking to me about his job, and he was asking me about my job. And he was a pretty nice guy, pretty friendly guy. But, anyways, so then after that, whenever I would see that guy at the gym, which was like at least 2 or 3 times a week, he would come up to me, he would say hey, or just nod his head or whatever. And sometimes he would make small talk if we happened to be using equipment in the same area. And usually we would be talking about lifting, which probably kind of helped me come off as a more likable and more normal guy than usual, since, lifting, fitness, and nutrition, that was like my main hobby at the time. So it was something that I was able to speak about more eloquently, I guess you could say, and come off more like a normal person because when you're talking about something you actually know about, yeah, it just comes more natural. So anyway, one day this guy came up to me and he asks me if I'm looking for a job, and I wasn't, so I said that. But he was like, "Oh, well, my company is hiring," and I forget exactly what he said, but basically, I think he must have, like, I think the company was going to give him a bonus for finding new recruits or something, because he was really adamant that I interview for this job. And for me, the job was like my same job title that I had at the time, but one level up. So I was like engineer one, and this job would have had the job title engineer two. So it was one step up in job title, and it probably would have paid a little bit better too. So, yeah, I agreed to interview for the job. So he gives me his card and he said to send him my resume. So then when I got home that night, I sent him my resume through email. And then, like 2 or 3 days later, I see the guy at the gym again, and he tells me he sent my resume over to the hiring manager. And he said someone would probably be contacting me within the next couple days. And I remember he told me the first step is a phone screen. And if you don't know, a phone screen is kind of like a pre-interview. And usually it doesn't involve any technical questions. And you don't really talk too much about the specific job. It's mostly just logistical stuff like, are you willing to commute to this location? How many years of experience do you have? How'd you hear about this job? And just basic stuff like that. And I guess the main reason they even do a phone screen is just to make sure you aren't retarded. And I guess to make sure you actually meet the basic requirements for the job. Like you have the required degree or whatever. So yeah, I specifically remember this guy telling me that the first step is a phone screen. And I forgot exactly what he said, but I do remember he even said it like it's just a formality, Like it's not something that anybody would ever not make it past. But I guess he didn't realize who he was dealing with. So fast forward a day or two, and I get an email from some HR lady at the company, and we email back and forth a few times just to set up a time to do the phone screen. And she also, in the email, she called it a phone screen, by the way. I have that in writing. And the person that I was scheduled to be talking to during the phone screen, by the way, phone screen, everybody kept saying that. The person I was scheduled to be talking to was an HR employee. because it had their name and job title and everything on the meeting invite. Because I had to accept like a meeting invite in Outlook. Yeah. So, anyways, it was an HR person. So, I'm expecting a call from an HR person to do a phone screen. So, just you would not expect any technical questions in that situation, right? Okay. Well, fast forward again to the day of the call, or actually, I guess it must have been like the day before the call, or maybe like 2 days before. I can't remember exactly, but it was somewhat short notice. I do remember that. So I get another email from this HR lady that I've been communicating with, and she tells me, there's been a change of plans. The person you were supposed to be talking to is on vacation, or they're sick or something. I don't remember, but they were out. So, anyways, she says, instead, I'm going to be talking to the engineering manager. So I just emailed back, like, okay, that's fine. And then a few minutes later, I get an email from the engineering manager, and basically he just introduced himself, and he basically repeated what the HR lady had said, that he would be filling in for the other person since they were out that day. And I specifically remember he wrote in the email something like, this will just be a quick informal chat. And he didn't call it a phone screen, but from the phrasing he used, he said quick informal chat. I remember him saying that informal chat. So, in my mind, nothing has changed really. It's still a phone screen. They're just having the engineering manager talk to me because their HR person isn't going to be there that day. At first, when I saw that I would be talking to the engineering manager instead of someone in HR, I did kind of think, oh, well, maybe we are just skipping the phone screen altogether. But then when he called it a quick, informal chat, that made me think, okay, so it is just the phone screen. All right, so let's fast forward to the big day, the day of the call, this so-called phone screen. I had scheduled the call to be during my lunch hour because it had to be during business hours, and I didn't want to take a day off just for a phone screen, because I'm thinking that's a max of like 30 minutes, right? So, not really worth taking an entire day off. So, I go out to my car during my lunch break, and I'm waiting for the guy to call me. And keep in mind, I'm expecting this call to be as simple as like, how'd you hear about this job? Are you willing to work these specific hours? When would you be available to start? And just, logistical type questions like that. Because at every step of the way, people are telling me this is a fucking phone screen, an informal chat. Okay? So I didn't prepare at all. But even so, because of my anxiety, when it gets close to time for the call, even though I'm expecting it to just be like a simple phone screen, I started to feel the anxiety coming on. And it doesn't matter how many times it happens. If you have social anxiety or even like just generalized anxiety, if you have the anxiety like I do, then it's like you never get used to it. It's not something you can get used to. When that wave of panic hits you, it comes on so quick, and it's just like, I don't know. It's very sudden, and yeah, it sucks. And I'm not even talking about like a full-blown panic attack, but just like a sudden rush of anxiety. It's kind of hard to explain, but if you know, then you know. And if you don't, then you can't even imagine it. So if you don't know what I mean, then don't even start to think that you know, because you don't. So I got that rush of anxiety right before my phone rang. But even though I was kind of panicking, I still had it in my head that this is just a phone screen. So it's kind of hard to explain, but basically, I had a rush of anxiety, but I still wasn't really too worried deep down. So I was like physically feeling the anxiety, and it makes it kind of hard to think, but I still knew deep down, or I believed deep down, there's really nothing to worry about. So my phone rings, and I let it ring a couple of times. Then I picked up, and so the guy introduces himself, and he started by telling me a little bit of just general information about the company. And then he was like, "Why are you looking for a job?" And I think I said something like, "Well, I'm not actually actively searching for a job, but I just thought it sounded like a great opportunity." So far, so good. Then he asks me if I'm okay with the commute because the location was like 45 minutes away from where I lived. And I was like, yeah, that's fine because I was already commuting at least a half hour each way to work. So at my current job. So it really wasn't that big a difference. So, up to that point, the call was going pretty much exactly how I expected it to. You know, he was asking me phone screen style questions. And I was responding, and I felt like I was giving reasonable responses. And I was even starting to feel a bit more relaxed because everything was going smoothly and it was all going exactly how I expected it to. And the guy, he was pretty friendly and everything. And yeah, it was going well. I was starting to feel more relaxed. And that's when everything went wrong. So he says something like, "Okay, well, I actually have your resume right here in front of me, so I guess what we can do now is we'll just go through your work experience point by point, and you can tell me more about each bullet point you got listed here." So as soon as he said that, I really started panicking. Like, how in the fuck is this an informal chat? Going through my resume systematically, point by point, going through every single bullet point on the resume. Like, it doesn't get any more formal than that. That's not an informal chat. And I didn't even have my resume with me, by the way. And yeah, sure, I should have had a copy of my resume on hand, even for a phone screen. But really, for a phone screen, you don't really need to have your resume on hand. But this wasn't a phone screen anymore. It started off as a phone screen. Everybody told me it was going to be a phone screen or an informal chat. And we were having a nice, easygoing, informal chat at first. Then this fucking guy, for some reason, decided to flip the script entirely. He just started doing an interview, a real goddamn interview, right then and there. Just let's go through every point, every bullet point on your fucking resume, systematically, formally. So anyways, it gets worse, by the way. We haven't even got to the bad part yet. So we start going through everything on my resume, point by point. And I told him, like, I don't have my resume on me, actually. I told him that. And he was like, "No worries. That's fine." So he was reading my own resume to me over the phone, then asking me to give more details about each thing. And at first, it was actually, I thought I was handling it pretty well at first. Because the first couple of things on my resume it was like some robotics projects that I did in college. And then my actual work experience from my, at the time, current job was under that. And I think I did a decent job of talking about my school projects because this was only a couple years after graduate, or maybe not even 2 years after graduating. So it was all relatively fresh on my mind. But then when it came to talk when it came time to talk about my actual work experience. So he asked me to kind of give a general description of what I did, and I was really struggling with that because I think it was, with the school projects on my resume, I had already practiced what I would say about those in interviews because those were what I put on my resume back when I was first looking for jobs when I was still in school. So I had practiced time and time again what I would say about those specific points. But I had never really thought about how I would describe my actual job experience in an interview setting because I had never, after I got that job, I wasn't applying to jobs. And I didn't prepare at all for this interview because I thought it was going to be a phone screen. And a lot of the things that I worked on in that job I had, it was new product development for the most part. So I was actually, I was legally not allowed to be talking about certain things because I had signed an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. And in the moment, it was hard for me to think of what I am and what I am not allowed to say. So I remember I was just a stuttering mess. And I did manage to give some kind of basic description of my job duties, but it just did not come out very well. And I did tell him that I'm not supposed to be talking about certain things. But yeah, I think I said something like, I work on designing new products and making improvements to existing products in so-and-so industry. And he was like, okay, cool. What kind of products does your company deal with? And this is where I really screwed things up. So I couldn't think of a good way to describe my company's products. And I'm not going to say here what exactly it was, but it's not anything that's hard to describe. So this is how retarded I am. I started to panic so much, I actually, I don't know if my brain just completely broke or what, but I just froze. I froze like I always do. And at this point, I think I might have actually been having I was legitimately having a panic attack. And I just froze. And so after a few seconds of me not saying anything, the guy asked me, he was like, "Are you still there?" And I was like, "Yeah, sorry, I was just thinking." Something like that. I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was something along the lines of, "Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I was just thinking for a second." So he was like, "Okay, take your time." And then I was still panicking, and I still couldn't think of what to say. And if you've ever been in a situation like that where you're having a social anxiety induced panic attack, then you know how it is, but it's like, by that point, I couldn't even think about what the question was that I was supposed to be answering. Because my mind was just bombarding me with thoughts like, you're ruining this, you're embarrassing yourself, you're panicking, you're screwing this up. And so, yeah. And at this point, I already knew, I'm not getting this job. I've already completely fucked up this interview. But at this point, I'm just trying to not, I should have just hung up the phone. But at this point, I'm just trying to not humiliate myself as best I can. And I remember I wasn't being totally silent during all of this because I kept trying to start talking. And I ended up it's like I was periodically stuttering. And I probably just sounded like, well, uh, so the, uh, just going on like that, making kind of like I'm trying to talk, but I couldn't say anything coherent. And mostly I was just kind of being silent, and it was interspersed with some random stuttering. So I did kind of say some things, but not like actual sentences, if you can imagine what that sounds like. So after a particularly long pause, and I remember this was after the guy had already asked me if I was still there once, and I told him I was. So then basically we got to that point again because I still hadn't really said anything. But this time I was kind of making some kind of noises, like I said. But I don't even know what it sounded like to him on the other end of the phone. But eventually he asks me, he was like, "Sir, is everything okay?" And I remember like the way he said it, it did sound like he was concerned. So I kind of paused for a second to think of what to say. And then this brilliant idea popped into my head. And so I intentionally dropped my phone. And I could still hear the guy saying stuff, by the way, while my phone was on the floor of the car because I had the volume up kind of loud. So then I picked the phone back up after a few seconds. So like I dropped my phone and then waited a few seconds before I picked it back up because I'm trying to like collect myself. So after a few seconds, I pick the phone back up, put it up to my head, and I say, "Sorry, I dropped my phone." As if that's like, as if that's my excuse for why I wasn't saying anything. And it didn't even make any sense whatsoever because, I was saying that I dropped my phone trying to explain the long pause and why I wasn't saying anything. But remember, I was actually kind of like stuttering and making some kind of noises. I just wasn't saying anything coherent. So obviously, I didn't just drop my phone. It didn't even make sense. And yeah, like I even physically dropped my phone to really try to sell it. But that didn't, thinking about it, like it makes no sense. And in my head at the time, I was like, that's like what my brain just thought, this is what I'm going to do. Like that was my fight or flight response, right? To drop my phone. Like that's so fucking clever. But I didn't even drop the phone until the guy had already asked me if I was okay. So if he did hear the sound of me dropping the phone, it wouldn't even explain why I wasn't talking before I dropped the phone. So, it's just like a harebrained scheme. It's like on the same level as something Wile E. fucking Coyote would do to try to catch the Roadrunner. It made absolutely no sense. But anyway, I picked the phone back up and I started to talk again, mostly just stuttering, still not really saying anything. Okay, so I remember I did start to tell him about one of our products. Because remember, the original question, he was asking me to describe like what kind of products I had worked on. So I finally thought of something, and so this is how stupid I am. So internally at this job I had, whenever we would talk about products, we would usually refer to them by their product number instead of like what they actually were. Because a lot of the products were pretty similar to each other, so it was just easier to use the product numbers when we were talking between coworkers. So on the phone with this guy from a totally other company in a different industry, obviously he would not know what my company's product numbers are referring to. But in my panicked, confused state, I actually started to say to this guy, I said something like, we have the 156231, which I've made some improvements to. And, then he cut me off and he was like, sorry, what is it you said? And I didn't even realize what I was doing at the time. So I just repeated it back to him like, oh, I was just saying one of the products I've worked on is the 156231. And he was just like, he paused for a second and he was like, I don't know what that is. And I still didn't realize what I was doing. So I started to say it again. Oh, the 15623. Then halfway through saying the number, I realized what I was doing. And I was just like, oh, sorry, that's the number. It's actually, and I couldn't think of how to actually describe the thing in words. And it's not, I'm not going to say exactly what it was, but it's not anything complex. Like, it's the type of thing that any engineer would know what it is just by a simple description, just by calling it what it is. But I couldn't think of the word for what the thing was. Think of like, I don't know, like a ladder or something, right? Everybody knows what a ladder is. I couldn't think of the word ladder. It wasn't a ladder, but that's just an example. So I could have just said, it's a fucking ladder. But I couldn't think of the basic word to describe this thing. All my brain could think of was the product number that we used internally at my company. So I remember I froze again and just wasn't saying anything. And after a while, again, this guy was like, sir, are you sure everything's okay? And I remember how he said it, he was like, sir, are you sure everything's okay? He's like, he was actually concerned about me. And I don't blame him. He probably should have been. Probably thought I was having a stroke or something. I don't know. And when he said that, I was just like, yeah, sorry, I'm fine. And then he was just like, okay, well, I'll tell you what. We're actually running short on time here. Blah, 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 whatever. And he ended the call early. So I fucked up so bad, he had to end the call early. And I don't blame him. I should have just hung up myself before it even got to that point. But yeah, and I mean, I do think it's not really fair that at every step of the way, I was led to believe that this was going to be a basic phone screen or an informal chat. Either way you describe it, phone screen, informal chat, neither of those things represent the reality of what this conversation was. Because in the reality, it ended up being more like an actual interview. Like a real formal technical interview. And I don't think that's fair to me. But at the same time, most people wouldn't have screwed it up that bad. Because, I mean, it's not really that out of line to expect someone to be able to talk about what they do at their job. But for me, I don't know, I guess that's just too much of a high pressure situation for me to handle. And I just couldn't handle it. Because I didn't prepare to talk about my job. So I couldn't do it. Because I have to prepare before I talk about something, or I can't talk about it. I wrote out bullet points of this, what I'm talking about right now. This story I'm telling you, I'm using bullet points to do this. Because I have to. So after that, obviously, I got a rejection email a few days later. But the next time I saw that one guy at the gym, so up until then, he was always the one that he would approach me and start a conversation with me. whenever we'd see each other at the gym. But the next time I saw him, he didn't. He did like ever again. And I would see him there at the gym all the time. I still saw him there all the time. And he just never said anything to me ever again. He didn't say hi. He didn't give me a head nod or anything. And I know that I probably should have approached him to tell him, thank you, thank you for hooking me up with a job interview. Because I did, in truth, even though it went horribly, I did appreciate it. Even though I wasn't actually looking for a job. But, for me, it's very hard. It always was very hard for me to even land an interview. And that's how it's always been for me. And I don't know why, because I've had people review my resume. And I graduated with honors, by the way. Like I was a magna cum laude, or whatever they call it, which basically just means I had a high GPA. But I'm just saying, I did appreciate that this guy got me a job interview like that. And I think I did thank him for it earlier, like before the actual phone call, when he was originally talking to me at the gym about, hooking me up with this interview. I'm pretty sure I did tell him thank you. But I probably should have thanked him again after the interview. And if even not in person, I had his email. I should have sent him an email saying thank you, but I didn't do that either. So, and I think maybe he expected me to. And maybe that's why he never talked to me again and didn't, it's like he was trying to avoid making eye contact with me. I guess. I was kind of avoiding making eye contact with him. And maybe that's the issue. For me, I'm fucking embarrassed about what happened at the job interview, so I couldn't look this guy in the eye. But it still felt pretty weird. Because the guy from the gym, he was always a very outgoing, friendly guy. And he would talk to me at the gym all the time. And then after I fucked up the interview phone screen, whatever you want to call it, it was just like, nope. He just never looked at me again, never spoke to me again, didn't even acknowledge my existence. So I don't really know what was up with that. Probably my own fault. Thinking about it now, I shouldn't blame that guy. I hold no ill will against him. But I do wonder, maybe I fucked up the interview so bad that it made him look bad for recommending me. And I don't know why it would, because I don't think he would have personally vouched for me or anything to get me the interview. I assume he just told them that he knew a guy that had the basic qualifications for the job, and they just interviewed me for that. But I really don't know. I don't know how the conversations happened between him and his hiring manager or whatever. I don't know what went on there. So maybe I made him look bad. So yeah, what it all boils down to, severe social anxiety, like what I have, it makes getting a job pretty much impossible. Because if you can't even get through a basic phone interview, you really have no chance. And even if I was like Giga Chad, the most handsome man in the world, it wouldn't even make a difference because this was just a phone interview. So the guy interviewing me didn't even know what I looked like. And the thing about social anxiety, on the level of severity that I suffer from it, it makes it impossible for me to deal with any kind of changes in the plan. Like with this phone interview, if I had been able to prepare, If I knew we were going to be actually going through my resume point by point and I could have prepared for that, I probably would have been able to make it through. I still probably wouldn't do great, but I could have made it through. We wouldn't have had this whole situation where I panic and then he has to end the interview early. But since they caught me off guard with the whole, oh, it's just a phone screen, it's just an informal chat, they caught me off guard. And maybe they did that on purpose so they could see how I would react. I don't know. That the thought has crossed my mind. But either way, I just can't deal with any kind of sudden changes like that. And I think I'm actually pretty good if I can sit down, prepare, make a plan in advance, then I think I'm pretty good at that. But when I am put in a situation that requires wit, that requires the need to think on my feet, I'm screwed. I'm just screwed. I can't handle it. I freeze. That's why I say I am a freeze cell. Because freezing is just like the story of my life. I always freeze. In any kind of situation, if things don't go exactly how I expected them to, then I freeze every time. So I really don't think I will ever be able to get another job. Because even if I manage to land an interview, it's hard to prepare for every single question they could possibly ask. And if they ask me something that I did not prepare for, then I will not be able to answer it. And I don't care what it is either. Like, they could ask me what month I was born in, but if I did not prepare for that question beforehand, I would probably just freeze. And the thing is, when you're panicking like that, I would be having let's say they asked me what month I was born in. I would actually have the most retarded thoughts running through my mind. Like, wait, so are they asking on the Gregorian calendar or, just asinine thoughts like that? It doesn't even make sense. I'm unemployable. It really is over. Social anxiety is basically a death sentence. Whatever.